Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another live stream. I hope you guys are all doing well. Um, Really interesting to see today. We've had a lot of conversation going on in the chat section since the past couple of hours. First of all, let me start off by apologizing, guys. This live stream was supposed to be earlier today at, I think initially it was at 2 p.m. or 1 p.m. and then things kept coming up, so I had to delay it till 5 p.m. So apologies for that. And I thank everyone that stuck around for staying around. May God bless you all. And hopefully we're going to have a really interesting session today. Now, today's live stream, what I want to do in today's live stream is I want to sort of go through certain sections of Joe Rogan's podcast, in particular, the podcast where he had or the podcast I'm referring to today is where he had a discussion with Firas Zahabi. In particular, the section that started discussing science and the woo-woo of science, where that whole discussion came up, which was a very interesting discussion. And the reason I wanted to go through this, because what happens in this discussion is Firas brings up some very interesting points in regards to the philosophy of science, which, when understood, they lead you to the realization that science isn't what some materialist types want to make it out to be. Science is a beautiful method, it's a phenomenal method, but it has its limitations. And those limitations are the things that some people are trying to skew and cover up with the aim of presenting science as something far greater than it is, and a discipline or a method which covers far more of a wider spectrum than it does. So that's what I want to highlight through this session today, or this live stream today, and going over certain specific aspects of that discussion where you really get to see, the whole discussion about the philosophy of science emerging and being articulated in a very interesting and clear way by Firas. So I want to do that. But before I do that, something I wanted to share with you guys. There is a book that I've been recently going through called The Science Delusion. It's not a new book, it's an old book, but it's a very popular book. I'm sure many of you guys have probably already read it, come across it, heard about it. It's by Rupert Sheldrake. I think that's how you say his name. And I always now have made a habit of checking if I'm saying the author's name properly or questioning myself. But yeah, Rupert Sheldrake, it's a very interesting book. It's called The Science Delusion, where he sort of exposes some of these underlying assumptions of science, which are just taken at face value by the materialists and assumed to be true. And then based on that, they basically run with that, presenting the image of science that they want to present. And what's very interesting, one of the things he highlights, which is going to be quite relevant to our discussion today, because they sort of expose to a great degree the sort of trust and belief some people have in science, some atheists have in science, which is displayed by Joe Rogan in this podcast, for example, which is this idea that science is a phenomenal method, it's led to amazing progress, and it's the bee's knees as far as knowledge is concerned and attaining knowledge is concerned, as far as the roots of knowledge are concerned. So one of the things Rupert highlights in his book, The Science Delusion, is that science in and of itself, there's nothing about the scientific method which is inherently atheistic or naturalistic. It doesn't lean towards any particular worldview or philosophy or ideology. It's just a method. It's a method that we use to try and understand the best we can the physical world around us. That's essentially what science is there to do. Science, therefore, is limited because it's limited to the ability of the human being to perceive, to use one's senses to be able to study and observe the material physical world around you, and after observing it and collecting data, to reason upon it. And that's essentially what it is. But what has happened is, since the 19th century, is that you've had the materialists who have been the main, if you like, the materialists who have sort of taken the reins of science, and they have brought this materialist flavor to science, this underlying ideology which has been inserted into the scientific discipline, and it's almost been blended in a way where you can't tell the difference between the two, and hence now when we look at science from a lay perspective, when we think about science, we think about the discipline, you naturally come to you naturally have this feeling or thought that, oh, science means there is no God. Science means there is no religion. Science means X, Y, and Z. But this has happened because of that materialist flavor that's been injected in. And essentially the only real thing between materialism and science, or the materialist philosophical way of looking at things in science, is that materialists believe that all that exists is the material physical world, and there's nothing beyond the physical. It's all physical. There is no supernatural. There is no divine. There's nothing like this, right? Therefore, hence the rejection of consciousness, etc., etc. And science deals with the physical material world, and that's the only thing that's really similar. So when the materialists take hold of science, they want to push this idea that, hence you get these ideas such as that science will explain everything. Eventually, give it enough time, science will give us the answers to everything. And they assert this because it's not because of science, but because of the underlying philosophy and the ideas, which is that all that exists is physical. Therefore, science deals with the physical. Therefore, science will eventually tell us everything that we need to know. There is to know, right? So you can see why they jump to such a conclusion or make such assertions. But what they fail to realize is that science will eventually tell us everything is a belief. It's not validated. It's something that's not been validated yet. It's a potential. It's a possibility. It's simply a belief on their part, and it makes you think: why would they hold on to mere beliefs when they want to, when it suits their agenda, when it suits their objective? Karl Popper, for example, he referred to this outlook as, he called it promissory materialism. That's how he referred to it. That's what he called it, which is the idea that it's promises that are being made about something that hasn't been discovered yet or established yet or proven yet by the materialist because it fits their particular agenda. So that's essentially what's going on here, and that's why you have people like Richard Dawkins and so on and so forth, who are atheist materialists that really want to push the idea that science is the way to all truth, etc., right? It's this phenomenal method. It'll tell you about everything when it really can't. When you really understand the philosophy of science and the nature of science, and what we're going to do today as we go through this particular clip or section of the Joe Rogan podcast with Firas, is we're going to see why that's not the case. And it's a beautiful way that Firas educates Joe Rogan on these points, because initially Joe Rogan goes into it, with almost this, dare I say, a type of arrogance where we have science, everything else, many other claims and views people have are just woo-woo, as he refers to them. But then Firas reminds him that, look, there's a lot of woo-woo in science as well, right? When he speaks about woo-woo, he's basically saying it's not as clear cut as some atheist materialists want to present science to be. Science isn't the way to absolute truth. It can't deal with facts, as far as facts spelled with the capital F. It can't tell you about many other things. You forget other things. Even when it deals with the physical material world, there's issues even in regards to trying to understand those things properly, for many reasons that Firas discusses and we'll touch upon in a second. So without further ado, guys, I'm going to start playing the clip, pausing it along the way. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. What we're going to do is we're going to look at a certain section or sections of the clip, which sort of summarize the whole discussion, because a lot of things were flushed out and repeated, and it'll take us a lot of time to do that. So I'm just going to go through certain sections. Let me know your thoughts in the chat section as to what you think in regards to the sections that we cover, and we'll try to have engagement that way too. So let me just quickly go over and start playing this clip.
System. Dude, scientists are just as guilty of woo as every other guy.
You think so?
Oh yeah, big time.
In what way?
Oh my God, man! Like there's scientists, and then there's philosophers of science.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much woo in science. Even the most popular guys have woo. They just never study the philosophy of science, so they don't really understand what they're saying per se.
Like, give me an example of woo in science.
I'll give you a great example.
Okay.
There's this guy named Isaac Newton. Okay.
I heard of that dude.
Yeah, and you're asking him, hey, Isaac, why don't I fall off the face of the earth? And he's gonna be like, well, Joe, there's this force of gravity pulling you down to the earth. The earth has a greater mass than you, therefore there's this force pulling you down. We call it gravity. And then some guy comes around, his name is Zahabi, and he tells you, no, Joe, don't listen to that guy. I have another theory, way more, it's truer than his. I believe there are gremlins pulling you down to the earth. They have lassos, these infinite long lassos, and every time you're falling off the earth, they pull you. Every time you jump up and down on the earth, they pull you back down to the earth. You don't see these gremlins, they're invisible, but that's what's pulling you down to the earth. Now, how do you know who's right and who's wrong? Who's telling you the truth, me or Isaac?
Well, Isaac lived a long time ago before they actually had provable studies that could show you why gravity works.
Name me one of those studies.
Well, I'm not a scientist.
Well, let me break it to you this way. No scientist has a study to prove us that gravity works.
Really?
That's the whole thing. That's what's scary about how we talk about the universe.
But they understand that gravity is in relation to the size and mass of objects. So the moon is smaller, therefore it has 1/6 Earth's gravity because it's 1/4 the size of the Earth. There's a standard formula that they can follow.
There's a correlation. Now, my theory of gremlins, which obviously I don't believe in, right? I'm using mythological language to make it really simple. Don't somebody misquote me that I believe in. You know.
Firas Zahabi believes in gremlins. He doesn't believe in gravity. He's a gravity denier.
Exactly. Well, there's less mass there's less atoms. The moon has less atoms, therefore less gremlins, less of them pulling you. Mm-hmm. My gremlin theory correlates with the gravity theory exactly, but I'm using a mythical language just to point out that every type of force we're talking about is an inference. It's something we project out there. We don't actually see gravity. And later on, Einstein debunked gravity, right?
What do you mean by he debunked gravity?
Isaac was totally wrong. Isaac's explanation of why you don't fall off the earth was totally wrong.
Well, what did Einstein do to debunk it?
Einstein taught us that a new theory, a new hypothesis, that gravity is a pushing force, not a pulling force. See, Isaac Newton, he debunked Aristotle. First, we used to believe what Aristotle used to say. Aristotle used to say, look, this thing has a natural place. It has to be stuck to the earth. That's its natural place. The force is within that one thing. That's why it doesn't fall off the earth. So when Aristotle saw a bird fly, he said, look, it has levity. Its natural state is to be in the air. The force that it carries it up in the air, it's within it. It's within the bird itself. Isaac Newton came around and said, no, that's totally wrong. No entity can move itself. It's only a force that's applied. So let's say you're walking. Isaac Newton would say, you're not pushing yourself forward. You're pushing the ground beneath you backwards. And the ground is pushing you forwards. So every action is opposite equal reaction. So when I run, I'm really pushing the ground behind me. It sounds like he's splitting hairs, but he's saying something actually very profound. He's saying you're pushing the earth behind you, and the earth is pushing you forward. There's a reaction there. So what they do to illustrate that to kids is they take like a train track, they elevate it, and they turn on the train. And then you see the train track starting to spin underneath the train. And it's showing you, look, the train is pushing the train tracks back. And the train tracks are pushing the train forward when they're connected to the ground. So when I put you on a treadmill, you're pushing the treadmill behind you. The treadmill is not pushing you forward because it's spinning along with you. But if I put you on the ground is pushing you forward now. So for every action, there's an opposite equal reaction. I'm sure you've heard this. Then Einstein comes along and says, no, that's totally wrong. Well, when it comes to gravity, okay, when the subject of gravity, he says, because Isaac Newton says this, look, the force of gravity is in the earth. The earth has this invisible force, this magical woo-woo thing. And that's what his contemporaries said about him. That's what his peers said. He said, oh, you're appealing to magic. What is this gravity thing? Where it's non-corporeal, it's not material, it's not made of a substance. Is this magic? And he was like, yeah, it's this force. You can't feel it, you can't detect it. It's just observable in nature. And for 300 years, everybody believed that. And then Einstein comes along and says, no, you guys are totally wrong. There is no mythical force called gravity. It's a pushing force. So really what he says is, let me get a sheet of paper here. Make it really, really simple. And I'm going to put it in a nutshell.
Okay, let's pause it there for a second. So the discussion carries on in regards to gravity, but I think the points made already here. And the first point I wanted to sort of touch upon was, for us, in a very simple and eloquent way, he highlights that science, it does not deal with absolutes in any way, shape, or form, right? Science is fluid, and that's the beauty of the scientific method, that science is fluid, that theories are revisable, they do change over time, new data comes in. Sometimes the data builds up to a point where there's a paradigm shift, and that's one of the beautiful things about science. But that also means, because that's one of the beauties of science, that also means that you can't say that any given scientific fact is an absolute fact. And this is something we need to really understand. And again, this is something that the materialist types won't want you to acknowledge or accept, especially people like Richard Dawkins. But that is the truth. Go to any reputable philosopher of science, read any basic book on the philosophy of science, and you will understand that science is fluid, it's dynamic, it doesn't deal with absolutes, it doesn't deal with facts. Or when you say this is a scientific fact, if you do use such language in the domain of science, you're not talking about absolute facts, right? You're not talking about, even if you like, mathematical facts, as Firas goes on to explain. You're talking about what's most likely according to your data and your interpretation of the data at any given time in history. That's essentially what you have. And when it comes to gravity, the point's illustrated in a very beautiful way, because he's highlighted that there's prior scientists had a particular view on gravity. Although they were both, all of us are, if you like, aware of gravity, whatever this is, to a degree. We're all aware of it. We're all experiencing it. But the way one scientist understood it in history, right, is totally different from the way another scientist understood it in history. Right, and that the way of looking at things was shifted because of new data and new evidence. Now we have Einstein's way of looking at things, which is what Firas is going to go on to describe, which we'll watch in a second. But that doesn't now mean that Einstein has given us what's absolutely true or what's a fact in regards to what we call gravity. It may very well be that in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years time, another scientist comes around and says, no, now we have a little more data and we're going to shift our view in regards to what we call gravity, or what this thing is, this force is, this law is, whatever you want to call it. And that's the point. We claim that we know what the gravity is, what the law of gravity is, what the force is now, and we will refer to understanding as true today in the 21st century. But it's not true with a capital T, just like it wasn't for Newton at a particular point in history, right? So it's very possible that in the next 50 years or 100 years' time, that whole outlook is revised again. And this is a very important point to understand, that science does not deal with absolute facts. It does not deal with truth with a capital T. It's just an attempt to best understand the physical, material reality around us, right? But we have to also realize, and this is, again, when you watch this whole discussion, we're not going to do it today, but if you watch the whole clip, it's very interesting, because this is also pointed out that just because science is limited to telling us about the physical material world, it doesn't logically follow that all that exists is the physical material world and there's nothing beyond it. That's what the materialists would have you believe and push. But the reality is, no, that's an aspect of existence in reality. And the proof of this is clear. You can take something as simple as morality, right? Moral truths. Then the science is amoral. It can't tell you about what's right or wrong, how to live, what's good or bad. Although some, such as Sam Harris, would desperately and have desperately tried to do that and failed. But this is the point here. So we have to, and one of the things I really want to get across in this live stream today is that you need to separate the materialist agenda and philosophical materialism, from science, because there's been too much mixing that's been going on deliberately over the past, at least the past 2 or 3 centuries, which has really blurred things for us, especially on a popular level. So we need to really understand, separate the materialist agenda and the materialist philosophy from science as a methodology. This is a very key thing that we need to understand. But let's play the clip a bit more and see where this goes.
Okay, but he says, look, Einstein says, look, space and time are one. Space is actually a thing out there. It's actually the space between me and you is an actual physical thing. He says the sun is so heavy that it dents it. It makes like a toilet bowl. And the earth is bumping around in that toilet bowl because space is actually curved. It's curved like this. Space is curved because the sun, imagine I put a bowling ball on your bed. Your bed's going to indent.
Right.
That toilet bowl shape, the earth is flowing around that toilet bowl shape. So it's a pushing force, no longer a pulling force.
So the weight of the earth is pushing down on space.
Exactly. It's bending space, literally. Its mass is bending space. Now, Isaac Newton thought light travels in a straight line only. And to prove this, Einstein said, look, light will bend. If I'm right, light will bend. So they observed the sun during an eclipse and they saw that the light bends. Light does not travel in a straight line. This is another belief that was debunked. I mean, how many scientific beliefs are debunked? Countless. or overturned, because a scientific fact is not a mathematical fact. They're two different things. A scientific fact can never go higher than hypothesis. If somebody understands the philosophy of science, he understands that every single scientific fact is not equivalent to a mathematical fact, 1 + 1 = 2. A scientific fact is always subject to cross-examination and new evidence. So have you ever heard of Thomas Kuhn?
Mm-hmm.
He's very famous for that, right? We have a paradigm. So during Aristotle's time, he had a paradigm. He thought the sun goes around the earth. It was an observational scientific fact. Every day he saw the sun go around the earth, literally. He said, look, guys, I'm using my senses to observe the sun go around the earth. And then one day we find out, no, that's an optical illusion. It's not true that the sun goes around the earth. It's the earth goes around the sun. Scientific revolution. Every scientific fact we have, or theory, including gravity, because gravity became the law of gravity. It was no longer the theory of gravity. It was so accepted, it became the law of gravity. Today, we don't understand gravity as Einstein understood it. As Isaac Newton understood it. We understand it completely backwards, literally backwards now. And that's true with every scientific theory, because science is always subject to new evidence coming to light.
Right, but the difference between Isaac Newton living like whenever the
So a very interesting point that Firas has just made there, and again, he's clarified the point once again, which is science does not deal with absolute facts. It deals with what's most likely and probable based on your understanding and interpretation at a particular time, based on the evidence you have and your reasoning based upon it, and your inferences based upon what you have observed. This is a very important point. And look, you can see another way you can see is this: if science was as the materialist atheist types wanted to present it to be, which was it deals with facts, absolutes, well, then you wouldn't have the science that we have today. We wouldn't have progressed the way we have progressed in science today. The reason we are where we are with what we have as far as what science has given us and all the amazing things science has been able to tell us about is because of this very nature of science, that we can, it's revisable, it's something that's fluid, it's something that's ever changing, it's almost alive from the perspective that, you know, new data keeps emerging. We as human beings keep studying new things. You know, we keep learning more. We revise our conclusions and our outlook and our views and our theories. You know, that data is saved and is passed on to the next generations of scientists who then further develop those ideas and get more data. Sometimes we backtrack, sometimes we go forward, you know, and that's the beautiful thing about science. Again, just to emphasize that point, the method of that we call science does not lead to absolutes, as the atheist or some materialist would have you believe. And obviously they want you to believe that for several reasons, which we mentioned in the beginning of the stream, and which I'll summarize again at the end. But the point here is we need to keep in mind science is fluid. It doesn't give you facts. It doesn't give you absolutes. It's just a method that tries to understand the material reality around us the best it can. Essentially, that's what it is. And therefore, it has limitations because the proponents of science, the beings that engage in the science and do the science, are too limited, right? So that's a very important point that we need to understand. And hence, therefore, we have paradigm shifts. You know, there are revisions, there are changes, there are different views, there are competing theories, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the beauties of science. And that's something we have to, which is not, we're not talking about conspiracy theories here. We're not talking about sacred, hidden, secret knowledge here. We're talking about simple, basic facts about the scientific method, which should be well known. So let's continue this and see where this goes.
Fuck, you lived. It's a long ass time ago.
300 years ago.
Versus the science that we're dealing with today. Like science today. But what woo-woo do you see in the science of today?
See what Rogan, again, now this, and we need to understand this point. He seems to acknowledge the woo-woo that was made at the time, but he's missing the key point here. You know, because he asked, well, what woo-woo do you see in the science today, right? And the woo-woo here, let's just define it for a second. The way I'm understanding it is that it's not crystal clear as people make it out to be. There's a lot of you know, funky ideas which may not be, which are as or beliefs which are as strange as many things that are outside of the scientific realm. But the key thing here was when Rogan says, what would you see in the science today? Again, there's an underlying assumption there that science has reached the point where now we can understand everything, right? And you would only have that type of outlook if you assume that the method itself was developing in a way where it got to the point where now it can tell you absolute facts. But that's not what we're talking about. That's not what Firas is highlighting to him. What Firas is highlighting to him is that regardless of the changes in the method or the refinement in the method, the point is that the method would always have this particular limit, if you like, which is that it will never be able to give you absolutes. It's always going to be a possibility that new data comes around, which then drastically shifts your particular outlook or your theory, right? And you have to change it and revise it. And that's not limited to the past. That's limited to whenever you do science in any time, in any era. There is never a point where, and this will be a point that comes up later, you never can say that this scientific theory is an absolute fact. It just doesn't work like that, right? Whether it's today in the 21st century, whether it's in the year 3000 and something, or whether it's in the past 400 years ago. That's just the way the method works. Now, there is a distinction here that I want to quickly highlight here. There is a difference between, and I think this conflation is made at some point in this clip, and we may come across it. There's a difference between an observation and a scientific conclusion or a theory. Now, this bottle is an observation, right? I'm not necessarily doing science when I'm just observing it. That's just an observation, right? Science isn't just observation. Science is when you do the observations, you do the tests, and then you reason upon your data and you produce your conclusion. It's the method is comprehensive. So sometimes what some people do is they would want to mix observations with scientific conclusions. We want to, again, separate those two things here as well, so we really understand this. So you can't conflate the two. An observation of a thing is not science, right? Science is observation plus more. And so it's important to understand that difference too.
Biggest culprit?
Yes.
Randomness.
Okay, we're not gonna do randomness. I'm gonna go into, because I'll encourage you guys to watch this for yourself, because Firas again makes a beautiful point in regards to randomness and how randomness doesn't really exist, because what actually exists is our ignorance of all of the processes in place which result in a particular cause or an effect. In a particular occurrence that takes place. Because we're ignorant of all of the intermediary steps, therefore we claim something to be random. It's a very interesting point that I encourage you guys to watch. But I'm going to jump straight to 24 minutes, because there's another very important point that he makes in regards to the philosophy of science that we need to clarify here. So let's play this from here.
Prove it. You can never prove a scientific fact past the level of hypothesis. It's weird. I know it sounds strange, but
what do you mean past the level of hypothesis? If you can prove it in studies and tests and show, you still don't buy it.
You have not eliminated every other possibility.
Okay.
So it's not the same as a logical fact.
How is that woo?
This is understood in the philosophy of science. It's comfortably accepted. It's not anti-science. Like, I'm not trying to say anything.
No, I know you're not. But
I'm a lover
you're
of
saying that science has so much woo, and I'm not seeing the woo part.
Okay.
See, I think Rogan's missing the point. The woo that's been highlighted is one of the aspects of the woo that's been highlighted here. And I'm actually starting to like that term right now, because it's allowing us to explain a lot. But what's been highlighted by Firas is what science is presented to be in the mainstream as something that gives you facts and it's clear and it's absolute. It really isn't that. It's anything but that. And that is a lot of woo-woo right there, honestly.
What I'm seeing is the necessary testing and the idea of incorporating new data and changing beliefs and ideas.
Again, this is it's a bit of a difficult thing to wrap your mind off in one day, but you have to think about it, and throughout time, it becomes clearer and clearer.
Okay.
When we observe the universe, all we see is pattern and regularities found in nature. That's it. We don't see actual physical laws. The physical laws are bookmarks inside our mind. We see the same pattern over and over again, and then we attribute a physical law. But that physical law doesn't exist out there. So here's a great example.
Okay,
let me give you a great example. Okay, let's say I'm about to flip a coin. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're going to tell me it's probably going to land on heads or tails. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know that logically, or is it based on your history with coins?
I know it logically and based on my history of coins.
Perfect. I'm arguing you don't know it logically. You only know it on your past history. Okay, so pay attention to this. This is a little bit weird. This is we gotta go slow. It's very weird.
Okay.
It's very it goes against our instincts. Okay, erase all your history with coins. You've never seen a coin before.
Okay.
And I flip it.
Right.
And now it turns into a butterfly. You've never seen a coin before. It doesn't surprise you. You're like, wow, turned into a butterfly.
Mm-hmm.
Then I flip a coin 100 times in front of you. 100 times it turns into a butterfly. Now I'm going to flip the coin the 101th time. You're going to be like, I bet you it turns to a butterfly. That's how we express science. We see the patterns and regularities, then we predict them.
So again, another very interesting point that Firas is making. I think he's covering a few bases with this, but something that stood out to me, and I think, again, we need to highlight, is that when it comes to the uniformity of nature, the first point, science rests on an assumption that nature is uniform. It is a fundamental underlying assumption of the scientific method that the nature is uniform. There is no reason to acknowledge it. There's nothing that proves this. It's just no way around it, right? You have to accept and acknowledge the assumption that nature is uniform, meaning there is an order to nature. It follows a particular pattern, meaning that the past or the future will be like the past was. It will follow that trend. Right now, and particularly on atheism and naturalism, from that perspective, the materialist outlook, there's no reason to assume this. There literally is no reason to assume this, right? But you have to acknowledge this to do the science, right? But what Firas is highlighting here, another very interesting point, is that the reason we're concluding things and we acknowledge things from this perspective is because of our past experiences. We assume that the future will be the same, right? It's based on past experiences. And this is a very interesting point. Let's continue for a second.
Science, this is a little bit. This is a good way to put it. Science is the faith. It's faith that the future will behave like the past. Science is faith that the future will behave like the past. So now you've developed the faith that this coin will flip into a butterfly, and now you can predict it.
That's a very powerful point. You know, that there is something we need to appreciate here, that there is a lot of faith in science too. Absolutely. You know, and again, the atheists and materialists won't like this. They don't want to acknowledge this reality, but you can't escape this. You can't run away from this, right? There is a lot of faith in science, and there's a lot of faith on the part of the materialist types, the materialist scientists as well. There is a lot of faith on their part, because you just have to acknowledge this. You know, there are axioms of science. Another axiom of the scientific method is, well, the real world is real. You have to assume this before you have the scientific method. Because if you don't acknowledge that the real world is real, that we're here and I'm here, and that this, you know, you guys are watching this live stream and you're sitting in your rooms and the chair you're sitting on is real, you know, there's no way of proving this, right? You cannot prove that you are where you are right now in the environment and the surroundings you're in right now. It's impossible. Now you may say, well, I can, because I can see it, I can smell it, I can taste it, I can touch it, etc. Well, how do you know that what you're seeing, what you're smelling, what you're tasting and you're touching is actually there? And how do you know it's not the case that you're a brain, as the famous idea that was suggested by many of the philosophers? How do you know you're not a brain in a vat on another planet where there's probes being stuck into you, making you feel like you're experiencing what you're experiencing, and making you feel like what you're experiencing is real? Or how do you know you're not in the matrix? It's impossible to disprove it, but it's basic. It's axiomatic. It's an assumption that you have to make to move forward. Because if you don't assume it, you don't have any knowledge. You can't do science, right? So that's another underlying fundamental assumption of the scientific method, right? That's the faith of science. Another faith which Firas is pointing out here is to do with the uniformity of nature. What's his Rupert Sheldrake in the Science Delusion? He, in his introduction, he highlights another very interesting example when it comes to the fine-tuning of the universe, right? And he presents it. I'll maybe read it to you at the end. But what he essentially says is, when it comes to the fine-tuning of the universe, the materialists, they don't want. It's a big problem, because you have to account for it, right? And they don't want to reach out to an external explanation, to a God type of explanation, right? So what they do is they postulate and they suggest and assert that there are many we live in a set of multiverses. There is an infinite number of universes, and they all have their, you know, particular arrangement of laws and constants, etc. And therefore, our one has just happened to be one that's ended up with the right configuration of constants and quantities, which allow for intelligent life to exist. So you can see how they try doing away with God by asserting a belief which has no evidence, literally zero evidence, right? An idea which has no evidence of a set of multiverses, or an infinite number of multiverses, just to do away with the God the God explanation, or any external explanation for that matter, right? So it's interesting that they to stick to the materialist domain, they have to adopt faith and make up makeshift beliefs just to sort of just fudge the gap, right? Because there's no evidence for it. And even if you assert that there are loads of multiverses or infinite number of multiverses, well, that doesn't mean God doesn't exist. It just means it's another way of looking at it as well. There's an eternal, infinite, eternal being, a creator who created an infinite chain of multiverses, right? And when it comes to the whole idea of multiverses, it's not anti-Islamic anyway. There is room within the Islamic tradition to acknowledge that there are probably, maybe, the other realms, other dimensions, other universes. It's possible. Because we know there's narrations of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he referred to the first heaven being within the second heaven as a ring in the desert, etc. So it doesn't, for one, it doesn't do away with God in any way, shape, or form. Secondly, you have to just make up things, just without any evidence. And that's quite contradictory from the perspective of the sort of evidence-based approach that the materialist takes. The individual that ascribes to scientism takes. People like Richard Dawkins take. So they're very inconsistent when it comes to these types of things. But anyway, let's carry on and see what Firas says next.
Wouldn't you say that science is the use of measurement to understand matter and things around us? I wouldn't say that it's using the past to predict the future. I would say that if you know that fire melts lead at a certain temperature, and this is provable, and then you can show this over and over again. Here's what we know about fire. It reaches a certain temperature. When lead reaches a certain temperature, it melts. It changes its form. Whereas if you want to do that same test to carbon-based steel, it requires far greater temperatures, and then we know that there's variables in matter.
So before Firas gives his take, there's something very important I want to highlight here. Joe Rogan is acknowledging one piece of the puzzle, but he's missing the other point here. So yes, when you do the science, for example, when it comes to water boiling, and Firas goes into this particular example, you do the test, you boil water, it boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Imagine you were doing that particular experiment right now. You're boiling water, boils at 100 degrees Celsius. That is you're measuring that reality. Okay, that's fine. But for you to claim or make a scientific claim that water boils, or make that scientific factual claim, fact with a small f, that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, you're not going to take that one particular experiment. It has to be repeated. And if it's repeated, then you're working within the framework of time. And therefore, what you're essentially doing is you're repeating things. And again, the whole idea of the past and assuming that the future will be like the past comes into play here again, because it's that accumulation of repeated tests which is making you leading you to the conclusion that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. But it's still possible that the next time you do it, it boils at a different temperature. There's always that room for error as well. And that's another point that he articulates.
This is something that you can prove and show. There's no woo to that.
Okay, water boils at how many degrees?
I think it's 250.
In Celsius, it's 100 degrees Celsius. I don't know about Fahrenheit.
Oh, you Canadians with your wacky metric system.
Is that a scientific fact?
Is it a scientific fact that water boils at a certain temperature? Yes.
Actually, no.
It's not?
They can boil water now. Water can resist boiling up to 200 degrees Celsius. If you put in a certain atmospheric pressure and suspend it in a certain liquid, if you change the circumstance,
suspend water in liquid.
They suspend it in a particular liquid that's not heated or cooled.
All right.
It's not supposed to. It doesn't affect the temperature of the water itself, and now water can boil at 200 degrees.
Okay, so you're doing something different to water.
That's the thing.
You're taking it outside of the normal Earth environment. So the variables also include Earth environment.
Agreed. But water doesn't inherently boil at 100 degrees. It's not a fact. But we believe it to be a scientific fact. We believe that water, if it gets to 100 degrees, is boiling. It's going to behave this way. As a matter of fact, no, there are many other things. That fact has been debunked. And there's countless amount of facts.
But wait a minute. Is that the fact's been debunked? Or is that when you add in sufficient external variables, then water takes longer to boil because of these variables playing into
Yes.
the properties that we already observed with water.
That's why whenever we have a scientific fact, there might be new information coming to change our view. Change our view of this fact.
Right.
Right?
So that's a very interesting point. Let me just try articulating this in a slightly different way. So another thing that they're concluding right now, which is very important as well, is that there's always, and this ties in with the issue of induction here, which is, there is always a possibility that you're going to get more data in the future, which is going to make you change your prior conclusions. And the reason is because you haven't done all the tests. You haven't got the full set of the data, right? Going back to the example of water boiling, there's always going to be another time when you're going to boil water, or water's going to boil. And if there's always that possibility, then there's always a possibility that at some point water will boil at a different temperature, maybe the different conditions, etc., as they've just discussed right now. So again, this is another reason you cannot say that a particular scientific fact is an absolute fact in any way, shape, or form, and that it can never be otherwise. That's just simply not the case. It's like, I'll give you an analogy. Imagine you're a scientist and you've been commissioned to go into the field. Say there's some big fields in the area you live, and your chief scientist has told you to go into the field and to conduct an experiment. And what you need to do is, your job is to observe the birds that fly over this particular field. Now you have a month, you sit there with your notepad and pen, and you're sitting there and you're just ticking away. And each time you see a bird fly over, okay, one bird flies over brown, another bird flies over brown, third bird flies over brown. And you do this every day. And say at the end of the month, you observe 1 million, say 10,000 birds, 20,000 birds. Every single bird you've observed has been brown. Now, what the scientist would do at this point, and he will induce, this is the element of induction here, which is he would make the conclusion that all birds that fly over the field of X area are brown, right? Now, the statement that's made is made on a limited set of data, right? Although it's extensive, a month is a long time. You can expand that out and do it for a year or 2 years. And the more time you give it and the more observations you do, the closer, or the more sound your conclusion will be, or the closer to the truth you will get. So if you, for example, if you see a ruler and you have one here and you have 10 at the top, 10, when you get to 10, it's absolute, and 1 is absolutely not true, right? Now, say when it comes to the color of the birds in this field, say you spend a month in the field and you observe 10,000 birds, you may be able to, when you make that conclusion that all birds that fly over the field are brown, that fact that you just stated, that scientific fact you stated, it may be somewhere about here, right? But if you say you spend 2 years in the field doing the same studies, and say you observe 2 million birds and they're all brown, you're getting closer to what's most likely true. Say you spend 10 years in the field. Yeah, you're getting even closer. But there's never a point where you say, I'm there. This is 100% fact. This is absolute. You're never going to get that in science, because you can always do more observations. You can always spend more time doing more observations. There's always people doing more studies and more observations. And this is another thing, a factor, which means that you cannot say a particular conclusion that you made, a scientific conclusion, is absolutely true or a fact. Right? It's just the way science works. Yes, it may be close to what's true. It's probably the most reasonable conclusion you have. And this is also why, when it comes to the evolution, for example, and this is why we always point out when sometimes people freak out, oh my God, human beings evolved. That's what science is telling us. This is an absolute fact. Richard Dawkins has said it. It's absolute. It's a fact. Therefore, it's a fact, and therefore Islam is wrong. Well, the issue here is when you start understanding these issues in the philosophy of science, you realize, well, not really, because yes, it's a working theory. It's probably the best theory that they have based on the evidence that they have thus far, but they don't have all the evidence. They haven't done all of the possible tests that can be done. And therefore, it's Darwinian okay, so you can go as far as saying this. The Darwinian explanation of evolution is a fact, scientific fact, as it stands today, but it's not an absolute fact. There is always a possibility that new data will come along in the future. Enough data will accumulate in the future, which will result in a paradigm shift. Although when it comes to the Darwinian mechanism in particular, this is a far stretch at the moment, not purely based on the science, but because the whole idea of evolution has become more than just the science, right? There's many other facets and elements to it today. It's ideological. But practically, from an empirical perspective, scientific perspective, if you get enough data which goes against the theory as it stands today and it accumulates, that's when you have paradigm shifts, right? And there is data against it. There is a lot of data which goes against the current notion of evolution. There is, right? But it's, when it comes to evolution in particular, I believe that it's not going to be as straightforward when it comes to a paradigm shift as other scientific facts are concerned. But that's another discussion in itself. Maybe we can have that discussion with Subur at some point, inshallah. But anyway, let's continue to see what's next.
This is not necessarily new information. What this is new additional,
more precise information.
But what you're talking about with water, you're talking about additional variables. Like that's just more science. That's not woo.
Okay, well here's some woo. Okay, because we
I wouldn't let him slip that easy. So now Joe Rogan seems to be acknowledging and accepting the way science really works. And if you really understand the way it works, it's beautiful. But I don't think Firas is saying that that's the woo, the beauty of the science. But what he's pointing out is the woo really is where people, one of the things I think he's pointing out is the woo really is where people try to, make science out to be something more than it is, right? And in their presentation of trying to make it more than it is where some of the woo lies when you really think about it. So let's carry on.
We talked about gravity was woo, okay? Randomness was woo, okay? Because we cannot find one instance of actual randomness. The causal line is complete, as Laplace would say. There's no randomness in the world.
So the randomness idea is just our inability to calculate unbelievably difficult variables.
Exactly. But it's a projection of your ignorance. Right. If you knew, you wouldn't be random. So for instance, I can't remember who coined the term, but they say, the man who says the tallest mountain I've ever seen is the tallest mountain. He's making himself the measure of truth. I measure truth. If you take that perspective, you're the center of truth. I'm truth. There's nothing outside of me that's true. Then you see randomness everywhere. However, if you believe in correspondence theory, that truth is independent of me and you, which I think most of us will agree, then randomness doesn't exist in that context because randomness only depends on you. And when things are true outside of your beliefs.
Right.
Let's take another classic woo term. Again, this is very advanced philosophy. I know it sounds crazy, okay, but this is what the greatest thinkers in history, report. Okay, what they've written down. Okay, you see this. You see a knife. Okay, let's look at Aristotle's theory of knives. Okay, so look at this knife. I show you a plastic knife. I show you a wood knife. I show you a metal knife.
Okay, before we go on, I'm not going to cover the whole aspect of essence because this is another very deep discussion in and of itself. But to try sticking to the topic, there's a question by Rose Heaton, and apologies, I know I haven't been able to get through a lot of your questions, but we'll go through the questions at the end. Rose Heaton says, what is a better method of finding the truth, the scientific method or the religious method? Now, I think there's a few things that we need to unravel here. Firstly, when it comes to which method, overall, generally speaking, which method is the best way of discovering a particular truth, it's relative. And that's something we need to acknowledge and appreciate. And unfortunately, since the 19th century, this is something that's been really undermined, that there are other methods to truth. And even when it's acknowledged that there are other methods to or routes to knowledge, those for some reason are placed right beneath the scientific method, which is given the crown, right? Now, why it's given the crown, obviously one is because it was pushed by certain individuals, so it receives the crown. Another reason is because science has led to a lot of progress from a material worldly perspective, and the focus of humanity has been the material worldly race for the material progress in the material world. So it's led to a lot of progress, and people have conflated because science has led to such great things and progress, which it has, no doubt, it's amazing, but therefore it's the best method to know everything. There's a lot of overlap and conflation here. So it's relative to what you're trying to inquire about. Now, if you're trying to inquire about the physical world, if you're trying to inquire about the solar system, for example, and the orbit of the planets, then absolutely the scientific method is probably it is the best method that we have to study that phenomenon. But if you're inquiring about morals and what's right and what's wrong, then science is the worst method we have to inquire about morals. So it's relative. When it comes to the question of God, science is, if you really understand, especially from an Islamic perspective, and I'm going to argue this from Islam, if you understand the concept of God in Islam, that we don't believe in a creator that's a part of his physical material existence, but he is the creator of the physical material existence. That's the being we believe in, the eternal being who is not physical and material itself or himself. Then you would understand, especially if you understood some of the points we made regarding the philosophy of science today, well, then science is one of the worst methods you can use to directly inquire about God's existence, because science doesn't have a foot in the door. Science can't reach that realm. And in that case, we would have to resort to other means. We can resort to reason. We can resort to philosophy to an extent. And we can resort to testimony to an extent. But there are other routes to knowledge. So the key thing being here, when it comes to which route, what method is best when it comes to acquiring knowledge, it's relative to what you're trying to inquire about. And that's a very important point that we need to understand and acknowledge. Science isn't the best method of inquiry or reaching the truth in regards to knowledge as a whole, right? Truth as a whole, meaning truth about every sphere of life or every aspect of life. But when it comes to inquiring about the physical material world, yes, science is the best method from that perspective, right? It's the best tool that we have. However, even within that sphere, there are limitations. Some of the limitations we mentioned today as well, right? So hopefully that addresses your particular point in regards to what we're saying here, because I think there's a lot of conflation there. People always say, okay, when it comes to truth, and they see truth as a general, what's the best method to inquire about truth? It's not that clear cut. It's relative. It's what are you inquiring about? And then we can assess what is the best method to inquiring about that particular thing. So hopefully that clarifies that point. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to the last section I quickly want to cover with you guys. Then we'll go through the Q&A, inshallah. Let's see. So it's about 1 hour, and I think this is a very interesting point that Firas makes in regards to consciousness here that I want to play for you guys.
But that there are many, many simulations inside of simulations.
Mm-hmm. Because we couldn't, that's what the egocentric predicament we were talking about earlier is. You cannot experience anything outside of your consciousness.
Right.
So you could be plugged into a machine right now, and this is just a big old dream.
Could be.
And that's why Descartes wanted to know what would be true, even if I was in a simulator.
And that's, I think, therefore I am.
Therefore I am, because for me to have thoughts, I'd have to exist. If you doubt the cogito, you've proved the cogito. Because to object to it, you first have to have existence.
Right.
Right. He refined it. I think thinkers refined it later on, and before him also. Many thinkers came to this conclusion. He just did it really famously.
He did it in one sentence too.
He did it in one sentence. He summed it up. That's why if you've heard of Occam's razor. Mm-hmm. If you use Occam's razor to an extreme, if you go to an extreme degree, everything with a doubt, you chop it. Everything that might be imaginary, inferred, logical, empirical, you chop it. What happens? You have a transcendent experience. If you take off all your paradigms, this takes a very brave human being to do, to remove everything that anybody's ever told you and have the experience of the one thing. What you would know, what you would come to, what mystics, that's why I believe that there's a place where you can get where religion is true and science is faith. And I know it sounds crazy, but there is a point, and I believe in science. Don't get me wrong. I can't praise science enough. But there is a transcendent experience a human has, and that transcendent experience is consciousness itself, not the content of consciousness. This is where people make a mistake. Consciousness itself, reality, your world is nested in consciousness. People think consciousness is within my brain. It's the opposite. Your brain, your body, yourself is in consciousness. And when we get to this point, then all our paradoxes disappear. There's no more paradoxes, logical paradoxes. Maybe if we have time, we can talk about logical paradoxes. They never end. But when we understand that our world is nested in consciousness, there's nothing happening in the world around you that's outside of your consciousness. It's only outside of your ego. The thing you associate with Joe Rogan is also happening inside your consciousness. Your brain is within consciousness. No brain has ever been observed outside of consciousness. See, in materialism, they have this philosophy called epiphenomenalism, that the consciousness is a byproduct of this physical brain. We have this physical brain, and your consciousness is like a byproduct. It's like a smoke. Now we ask them, how do you know about this physical brain? Oh, we know it because of our consciousness. So if your consciousness is fake, unreal, then so is your brain. Your brains, the reason why we all know about brains is because of consciousness. Consciousness tells us about brains.
I think this was a brilliant point. This was It's such a profound point that he makes. And by the way, when it comes to consciousness, Hamza did a live stream with me last week, so definitely check that out, guys, if you're interested in that topic of consciousness. But something I want to mention is what he's mentioned there is phenomenal, because what he's highlighted is that if you really think about consciousness, there's not even you can't even go into the realm of you can't sit there and question consciousness, and you can't therefore assert, like the materialists assert, that consciousness is an illusion. And it doesn't really exist, because consciousness is what's basic here. Consciousness is that first thing. Without consciousness, so what he's highlighting, without consciousness, you can't inquire about consciousness, right? Now, if that's the case, when you inquire about consciousness and try to deny it, it's absurd, because it's just a vicious circle. Because how can you deny the very thing that you need to be able to deny it? It just doesn't make any sense. It's a vicious circle. So consciousness is that basic thing, if you like, that you need before you even inquire about it, right? So it's that first thing before you even think about brains. You need consciousness. Before you evaluate brains, give your theories on brains, give your theories in regards to consciousness, you need consciousness, right? So you can't refute it, because you need it. In the same way, when it comes to rationality, you can't inquire about whether you're rational or question if you're rational, because you need rationality to be able to question rationality, right? And so you have to assume rationality works and that we are rational before you go on that journey of inquiring about rationality. And if that's the case, then what sense does it make in going ahead and inquiring about rationality? Because it's assumed. You need it to move. In the same way, without consciousness is that base. Without it, you can't inquire about anything. You can't inquire about consciousness, right? And then what sense does it make in denying consciousness consciously, right? It just doesn't make. It's absurd. It's absurd. And in a similar way, when Sam Harris tries to argue the self is an illusion, and he gives you a little thought experiment. He's like, okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go in search of the self. Look inside yourself. Look at it down here and then look it up here. Can you find it? Can you find yourself? Look in your head. Where is it? Are you looking? Look for it here, there, and everywhere. And you realize, and he says that you realize that you can't find yourself, when you go and search for yourself. And therefore, to you, the I doesn't exist. Well, the absurdity is who's going in search, right? You need your conscious awareness, your consciousness to go in search of yourself. Right? You need the I in the first place that goes in search for the I, according to him. Now, if the I is going, if you need the I to go in search of the I and to disprove the I, well, you can't do that because you need the I in the first place. I know it's quite technical, but when you get your head around it, it really highlights the absurdity of this whole thing, the absurdity of denying consciousness as this non-material reality. And I think that was a brilliant point, the way he made that particular point. So that was that. There's a lot more there, but I don't want to take. I think the point's made, and I think what was beautiful about this clip, and what really, I think the woo-woo that Firas really exposes is this perception. For me, at least, one of the greatest woo-woos that he's exposed in this podcast, and may God bless him for this, is this perception that people have of scientists, and this idea that's pushed by those that ascribe to scientism, the materialists, that science is this phenomenal method that leads you to all truth, when it really doesn't. When you just simply inquire about it in a very simple, basic way. And it's the materialists that are pushing science and propping it up to be something more than it is, and pigeonholing it in many ways too. Now, I want to quickly read you this, and there's the point I made earlier. But I think it's put in a very, very beautiful way, and I really recommend you guys, if you haven't already, read the Science Delusion, because there's some things. Obviously, there may be many things you don't agree with in there, but there are some things which are very powerful. And what Sheldrick says on page number, what page is this? Sorry, I'm doing this on a Kindle, so I'm it's in the introduction basically, and he says, the cosmological anthropic principle asserts that if the laws and constants of nature had been slightly different at the moment of the Big Bang, biological life could never have emerged, and hence we would not be here to think about it. So, did a divine mind fine-tune the laws and constants in the beginning? To avoid a creator God emerging in a new guise. Most leading cosmologists prefer to believe that our universe is one of a vast and perhaps infinite number of parallel universes, all with different laws and constants. The M theory also suggests we just happen to exist in the one that has the right conditions for us. This multiverse theory is the ultimate violation of Occam's razor, the philosophical principle that entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity, or in other words, that we should make as few assumptions as possible. It also has a major disadvantage of being untestable, and it does not even succeed in getting rid of God. An infinite God could be the God of an infinite number of universes. Materialism provides a seemingly simple, straightforward worldview. Materialism provided a seemingly simple, straightforward worldview in the late 19th century, but 21st century science has left it behind. He articulates in a very, very beautiful way. And then he concludes his introduction by saying, I am convinced that the sciences are being held back by assumptions that have hardened into dogmas, maintained by powerful taboos. These beliefs protect the citadel of established science, but act as barriers against open-minded thinking. And I thought that was quite a phenomenal insight, because the whole idea, or one of the major ideas behind the scientific revolution, and in particular the Age of Enlightenment, was the push for free thinking. And inquiry without any dogma. But essentially what's happening is that the materialists today are inventing and pushing their own type of dogma and limitations, which is constricting, if you like, the scientific method from many different perspectives. And that's a very sad thing to see. That's a very sad state of affairs. There's a whole discussion, obviously, we can have in regards to the way Muslims during the age of or the golden age, as is referred to in Muslim history, in Andalusia and Islamic Spain, the way they saw science was slightly different from the way that it's being seen by the materialists today. And I think it was quite profound, because the thing with science is, and again, there's this strange narrative that's out there, guys. This weird idea that's pushed that Islam is against science. Religions don't want you to be scientific. They don't want you to be progressive. They don't want you to grow. It's backwards, and science is leading us into the future. All of these strange and absurd ideas and notions that are being pushed in the world today. When in actual fact, if you look at it from the Islamic perspective, the reason Islam didn't need an age of enlightenment was because God encouraged the human being to go out and study, to go out and do the science, observe the world, see the world. Constantly throughout the Quran, God tells us to observe, use our senses to study the world around us, to engage with the world around us. Because not only would it inform us from a historical perspective, but we would progress as humanity, and we'll be able to better help humanity going forward. So God has encouraged us to look into the world and do what we call science today. I believe this is one of the things that the Muslim scientists of the golden age understood. Hence, they inquired and they learned and they transferred knowledge of the past to the future and translated it and made such great leaps and in regards to their discoveries and what they were able to learn and inquire at that time. Now, obviously, some people will make the argument, well, that's the history. What are Muslims doing today? And that's fair, because unfortunately, we have moved away, I would argue, from what, at least from one aspect of how the Muslims understood the perspective of science and how we should engage in the sciences, that we've lost interest. We've just become, unfortunately, one of the reasons is we've become excessively materialistic. We've fallen into the traps of the world that we live in today, and we've stopped doing what we should be doing, which is studying, man. And studying doesn't just mean going to universities and getting a formal education, right? That's, many would argue against the usefulness as far as real knowledge is concerned when you go to university and you study, and whether you actually learning how to think or you're just being taught what to think. There's a big discussion there as well. But we should carry on learning. We should carry on studying. People of the past, the Muslims of the past, and again, most of the non-Muslims and atheists, either if they know this, they don't want to acknowledge this, or most of them are just ignorant of this fact. Is that the Muslims of the past, the scholars of the past, man, they were people who weren't just scholars. They were polyglots. They were polymaths. They were experts in several different disciplines. You know, they were mathematicians, they were scientists, they were philosophers, they were psychologists, and they were religious scholars and jurists, etc. I mean, it blows our mind when we think about it from today's perspective that they could do, you know, they could be masters of so many different subjects. And the reason was what empowered them and propelled them was the Quran. I mean, how does the Quran start? Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq. The very first word that comes down to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, was read, recite in the name of your Lord who created. Just think about the importance and then the significance of studying and learning that's being emphasized from the very first word of the Quran. You know, and it blows your mind. The Prophet ﷺ encouraged learning and studying. You know, so we need to, as Muslims, learn and study and keep learning things and sharing things with people. And one of the best things we could share with people is the Quran, and learn the Quran and to share it, because you know it's the most profound source of knowledge that exists on the face of this earth today. But unfortunately, we're not aware of it. I'm not aware of it fully. You know, probably not aware of it any more than anyone else, any other Muslim brothers and sisters that are on the live stream right now are. And that's unfortunate. And that shows we need to learn and we need to acquire useful knowledge that will benefit us and benefit the non-Muslims out there. Because look, it's very easy to sit here, guys, and I'm going to wrap up on this point. It's very easy to sit here for me and for us online and to say, these non-Muslims, these atheists, these materialists, they hate Islam, they're misrepresenting Islam, you know, they don't know what they're talking about, they've got it all wrong, etc., etc. But we need to look in on ourselves and really understand that a lot of the perceptions that atheists and non-Muslims have about Islam is because of us. What are we doing to change those perceptions amongst non-Muslims? We shouldn't blame them. We should blame ourselves first and foremost. Right? What are we doing? What are we doing to help that situation? You know, otherwise we're falling into the same trap many atheists fall into when it comes to the problem of evil, for example, right? Why is there evil in the world? Why would God let this happen? Well, what are you doing about it? Right? What are you doing about it? Maybe it's in God's great wisdom and his perfect wisdom and in his plan that evil and suffering that's taking place, that you would get the opportunity to do something about it and remove it. And that's how God's mercy is going to manifest. Yeah, so we need to, from that same very similar perspective, we need to look in on ourselves. The perceptions non-Muslims have about Islam. Fine, yeah, sure, there may be elements of non-Muslims misrepresenting Islam, etc., because they have an agenda. But what are we doing to rectify this and change this? And I'm sure there's many sincere and honest non-Muslims that are going to watch this and look at this video, and you know, I really encourage them to, you know, forgive us as Muslims for our shortcomings as far as sharing the message with you. And doing it in a clear way, and secondly, to encourage them to look into Islam. And the Muslim brothers and sisters, you guys that are on this right now, please, you know, make it a life goal to study. You know, just to study something, study the Deen, study the Quran, study something, and study things that are useful that you can share with others. Don't study the Deen. At least, you know, it shouldn't be the primary focus. We shouldn't be studying the religion so we can argue with each other. You know, we have a far greater job that we need to do, which is to deliver the message of Islam to humanity. Study the Deen with the primary emphasis on helping yourself and helping the others that are out there that are not aware of this message. That's what we need to think about. You know, it's very important we do this, guys. Inshallah. Please share this live stream as well on your channels. If you know, it takes a second. Just click it, share it. Let's get it out to as many people as possible. Yeah, I just went off on a rant. Apologies. Let me go through the questions and we'll wrap up. Okay, let's see. Okay, so there's a lot of points here. I think a lot of it was discussions amongst you guys as well, which is good, which is brilliant. Oscar is here. I hope you're well, Oscar, and things are good, man. You're a regular. I really appreciate you coming on and participating in a civil way, which is very nice to see. May God guide you and guide us. Okay, let's see. Okay, sorry, I just popped this on by accident. Okay, so I think most of the stuff we've addressed. A lot of the questions are coming up or that were there, and a lot of it's discussion amongst you guys. So we're not going to go into the questions. But anyway, guys, hope this was beneficial. Hope there's something we're going to take from this. Make sure to share this with everyone on your page. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Let's get this information out there. I will be joining you guys tomorrow. If you're not aware already, I've got a live stream tomorrow with brother Adnan Rashid, inshallah. God willing, on Sadhguru and Sadhguru's views in regards to God and the purpose of life. So it's going to be an interesting one. If you guys can make it, please make it to the live stream, and I'm sure you'll find it beneficial. May God bless you guys. Thank you for coming on. Please share, please subscribe, and I will speak to you guys inshallah tomorrow. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.